The boy's name was Daniel, but none of the other children knew it. He was simply the quiet one, the boy who sat in the shadows, who never joined in the games or laughter that filled the small village. Even when the summer days were long and the children played late into the evening, Daniel would sit at the edge of the clearing, under the large oak tree where the light never seemed to reach. His face was always half hidden in the gloom, as if the shadows clung to him, reluctant to let him step fully into the sun. Sometimes he would watch the other children from a distance, his dark eyes unblinking, his expression unreadable. Other times, he sat with his back to them, his lips moving silently as though in conversation with someone none of them could see. At first, the villagers thought nothing of it. Children had strange habits after all. Perhaps Daniel was simply shy or slow to make friends. But as the years passed, his behavior only grew more peculiar. He never spoke to the other children, not even when they tried to invite him to play. They would call his name, waving for him to join their games, but Daniel would only glance up briefly before retreating further into his world of silence. It wasn't just during the day that Daniel's odd behavior worried people. At night, when the village was quiet and the only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional cry of a night bird, Daniel would be seen wandering. He didn't walk with the careless steps of a child, lost in a dream of adventure. His movements were deliberate, as if he were following a path only he could see. Sometimes, a villager would look out their window in the dead of night and catch a glimpse of Daniel sitting at the edge of the woods, his face tilted up to the moon, his lips moving in that silent conversation. His grandmother, who raised him after his parents died in a fire, thought it was a phase. "He'll grow out of it," she would say to the concerned whispers of neighbors. "He's a quiet boy, but all children find their way eventually." But deep down even she began to worry. She had found him talking to himself late at night, his whispers just loud enough to disturb her sleep. "Who are you speaking to, child?" she asked once, her voice soft and patient. Daniel looked at her with those dark, unblinking eyes. "Just them," he replied. "Who's them, dear?" He said nothing more, just stared at her for a long moment before turning back to the darkness of the night. As the years passed, the whispers about Daniel grew louder. Some of the children began to avoid him altogether, afraid of the stories they had heard from their older siblings. "He talks to ghosts," one would whisper. "My brother said he saw him talking to someone in the woods, but there was no one there." It didn't help that strange things began happening around Daniel. Animals in the village, usually stray dogs or cats, were found dead, their bodies twisted and broken in unnatural ways. No one could explain it, and though no one dared to say it out loud, everyone suspected Daniel. There was something about the way he moved through the village, his silence so oppressive it seemed to smother the very air around him. The nights were the worst. More than one villager had seen Daniel walking through the woods late at night, his small figure barely visible in the pale moonlight. Always alone. Always whispering to himself. Sometimes, the wind would carry snatches of his voice back to the village, though the words were always garbled, too quiet to understand. One night, Daniel's grandmother woke to a sound she couldn't place. It was soft, almost like the creak of old wood. She sat up in bed, listening. The house was silent, save for that faint creaking noise. Slipping out of bed, she pulled on her robe and stepped into the hallway. The sound was louder now, like footsteps moving slowly through the house. Her heart raced as she followed the noise. It led her to Daniel's room, where the door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open and found him sitting on the floor, facing the window. The moonlight streamed in, casting long shadows across the room. He was whispering again. "Daniel?" she called softly, stepping into the room. He didn't turn around. His whispering continued, though it was louder now, and she could almost make out the words. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, her voice trembling. For a moment there was silence. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like Daniel's, he replied, "They're waiting." Chilled to the bone, she crossed the room to him, her hands trembling as she placed them on his shoulders. "Who's waiting, Daniel?" He finally turned to look at her, his eyes dark and hollow. "The ones in the dark." That night, Daniel's grandmother didn't sleep. She sat by his bed, watching him as he slept peacefully as if nothing had happened. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning when she woke, Daniel was already gone. It was an autumn evening when Daniel disappeared. The air had grown crisp, the leaves turning fiery shades of orange and red, falling like embers around the village. The sky, streaked with the last light of dusk, seemed to press down upon the rooftops, heavy with the promise of an early night. Daniel had been unusually quiet that day, even for him, his strange behavior casting an even darker shadow over the village. He hadn't spoken to his grandmother since the previous night's strange incident, when he had whispered of those waiting in the dark. That evening after supper, Daniel slipped out of the house without a word. His grandmother, absorbed in her knitting, had barely noticed him go, assuming he was doing what he always did, walking alone in the evening, drifting toward the edge of the woods like a ghost lost in its own thoughts. It was only when the sky turned fully black and the moon began to rise that she realized something was wrong. Daniel had not returned. The air had grown unnaturally still by the time his grandmother stepped outside to look for him. The village, which was usually quiet after nightfall, felt different, like it was holding its breath. There were no lights in the windows, no murmur of voices from behind closed doors. The wind, which normally rustled through the trees, was silent. It was as though the entire world had paused, waiting for something terrible to happen. She called his name softly at first, expecting him to emerge from the shadows as he sometimes did, silent and brooding. But there was no response. Her voice grew louder, more frantic as she ventured farther from the house, moving through the narrow streets, past the fields, and toward the old house that sat at the edge of the village. It was the kind of house people spoke about in whispers, a relic from a time long gone, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls worn and crumbling like the decaying bones of some forgotten creature. The villagers avoided it, saying it was cursed, though no one could remember why. But Daniel had always been drawn to places like that, places that others feared. His grandmother's heart sank as she realized where he must have gone. The house loomed at the far end of the village, its silhouette crooked and jagged against the darkening sky. It stood apart from the rest of the village as if even the land had rejected it. Vines had overgrown its exterior, and the roof sagged in places where the wood had rotted away. It seemed like it could collapse at any moment, yet it had stood there for generations, watching over the village with its dead, empty windows. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the house, calling Daniel's name again, though her voice faltered as she neared the gate. The iron gate was cold to the touch, rusted and barely hanging onto its hinges. The path leading up to the front door was overgrown with weeds, the stone cracked and uneven. The house felt alive in its decay, like a creature sleeping lightly, waiting to wake. She hesitated at the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. She had never been this close to the house before, and now that she stood before it, she could feel the weight of all the stories, the unease the villagers felt about the place seeping into her bones. But Daniel was inside. She was sure of it. And she couldn't leave him in there alone. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door, which groaned on its ancient hinges. The inside of the house was suffocatingly dark. The air was thick with the smell of rot and mildew, and the floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped into the narrow hallway. "Daniel?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow up the sound. She took another step forward, her hand trailing along the wall for support. The corridor stretched out before her, long and shadowed, like the throat of some great beast, waiting to swallow her whole. Then she heard it, a scream. A piercing, gut-wrenching scream that seemed to come from the depths of the house. It was Daniel. She was certain of it. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her heart hammering in her chest, the fear tightening around her like a vice. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in on her as she ran, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. The scream came again, closer this time, pulling her deeper into the house, into the darkness. She reached a door at the end of the corridor, its surface scarred and weathered. Her hands shook as she grasped the handle, pushing it open. The room beyond was pitch black, the air thick with a coldness that cut straight through her bones. "Daniel?" she called again, her voice trembling. At first there was nothing, just the blackness, thick and impenetrable. But then, in the far corner of the room, she saw it. Two glinting lights, faint at first but growing brighter as she stared. They were eyes. Daniel's eyes. But they weren't the eyes of the boy she had raised. These were different, darker, colder, and filled with something inhuman. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The eyes moved, shifting in the dark as a low growl rumbled from the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. Something wasn't right. This wasn't Daniel. This thing, whatever it was not her grandson. The shadows seemed to ripple around him, twisting and shifting as though the darkness itself were alive. The eyes blinked, slow and deliberate, never leaving hers. "Daniel, please come home," she pleaded, stepping forward, her hand outstretched. But as she moved closer, the air around her seemed to grow colder, thicker, like she was moving through water. Suddenly the growling stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. Then, without warning, Daniel lunged from the shadows, his small body moving with a speed and strength that defied his frail appearance. His hands, cold and claw-like, gripped her wrists with a force that sent her stumbling backward. His eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, bored into hers as he pressed her against the wall, his face inches from hers. She gasped, struggling to breathe, but it was no use. The boy, no, the thing that had once been her grandson, was stronger than she could have ever imagined. His breath was hot against her skin, his teeth bared in a twisted grin that sent a shiver of pure terror down her spine. "Daniel," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper, "please?" But it was too late. She saw it now. Whatever had taken hold of Daniel was not going to let him go. The darkness in his eyes was ancient, malevolent, and hungry. It wasn't just him she had come to find in that house. It was something much older, something that had been waiting in the shadows for years, biding its time. And now it had her too. With a guttural snarl, Daniel, or whatever he had become, lunged forward, his jaws snapping, and everything went black.